Hello everybody. Please feel welcome to the channel Mundo em Análise. Here I'm arranging a foreign series, which is some videos and some talkings with friends and scholars and people who actually knows a lot and lives a reality which can explain better the issues we are facing in Brazil and almost everywhere at this point. This is important because we usually have only one point of view, the one we understand, the one we comprehend, and sometimes it's better to listen to someone else, to someone who is facing a different reality, someone who is facing a lot of different issues, a lot of different topics, a lot of different variations of what we consider the only truth. This can be very harmful if we stand on our own way of thinking, on our own way of seeing the world. So the main purpose of this channel is to be not only informative, but also to help people understand, help people to cope with the reality they are living on. This can be true in Brazil, this can be true in the United States, Argentina, and elsewhere. So please feel free to send suggestions, to subscribe, and to add whatever you think it's important. Thank you for being here and hope you will be satisfied with the content. Thank you very much. So here we are receiving today Dr. Robert Evan Ellis, Research Professor of Latin American Studies at U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute, Pennsylvania. As Brazil tends to see itself as an island inside Latin America. And it became a real problem now because all Latin America countries seems to be doing something while we seem to be stuck here. So as you are a researcher, specialist in Latin America and inside the United States, I would like to know your view of Latin America. How do you think things will come up after the pandemic, especially relating China's interest in here, while the United States seem to be fading away in our region? So please feel free to talk and add whatever you think it's important for us. Thank you very much again.
Luis, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to be on your program. First of all, to talk about Latin America a little bit as a region and its relationship with the United States, and then turning to what's happening in the region right now and how COVID-19 has impacted that and how China has impacted that. But I think it's important to start out with the complex relationship that the region itself has with the United States. I oftentimes do my best to remind my colleagues in Washington that there is no other region of the world that is as connected to U.S. security and prosperity by ties of family, by ties of geography, by ties of commerce than Latin America and the Caribbean are. If you look at the numbers, according to the International Monetary Fund, last year, Latin America had about $709 billion worth of bilateral trade with the United States. Its trade with China was about $330 billion, or about half of that. The trade with the United States was generally a surplus, or at least many high value added products. Whereas with China, it was much more exporting of commodities and importing higher value added goods. But certainly there's a case to be made that for both Latin America and for the United States, the economic tie is very strong. And not only in terms of commerce, but also in terms of bilateral investment and the number of U.S. companies that have a presence in Latin America, particularly Mexico and in Central America, and to a degree further south. And also the degree to which there are ties of family. Most recent U.S. census indicates 60.5 million people in the United States, about 18% of the population, trace their origins to to Latin America and the Caribbean. So it gives you an idea that this is a very personal thing, but also personal, as we've seen with U.S. politics, that when things are good in the region, there is a mutually beneficial relationship. But when there are difficulties in the region, as we've seen with the migration crisis and things like that, it becomes not a foreign policy issue for the United States, but it becomes a matter of U.S. domestic politics and domestic national security. So there are those ties. Now, it's also important to recognize that there are a whole series of complex relationships and how new generations perceive its relationship in the past, what's taught in Latin American schools. And a lot of that has to do with the perceptions of U.S. intervention in the affairs of Latin American states during its history, and that creates certain sensitivities. On the other hand, we can recognize that at a personal level, there are many people in Latin America with positive stories and relatives in the United States. If you look at many parts of Latin America, especially Spanish-speaking Latin America, you find many what they refer to as barrios Kennedy, places such as those neighborhoods that during the 1960s, 70s, 80s benefited from engagement through programs like USAID, etc. And I think in general, although attitudes are complex, Latin America at least partly sees the United States as a place where things work, as a place where people are good-hearted. Admittedly, during the previous administration of President Trump, although some in Latin America were happy at the level of non-interference in the internal politics, at least if you weren't Hugo Chavez or Miguel Diaz-Canel or Nicolas Maduro. But on the other hand, there was, I think, a bit of an alienation with the perceived America's first and transactional nature. And in many ways, although there was long a deep distrust towards the PRC in Latin America, at least distrust towards the Chinese people and the Chinese government in general. I think the transactional nature of the previous administration, in many ways, helped to free up Latin Americans who wanted to take the Chinese money by saying, well, it's U.S. money and Chinese money, and it's just two great powers. So what's the harm in taking the money and not getting ourselves involved in this competition? And so I think a lot of the is taking Chinese money, is engagement with China actually good for the long-term development of Latin America? A lot of those questions were put under the table and kind of suspended in an act of cognitive dissonance at the time. Now, again, talking about the region itself, obviously, we are, Latin America historically has gone back and forth between, left and right solutions to the endemic problems of poverty and corruption and unequal development. And one of the things that, of course, we're seeing right now is that we are in a moment, perhaps more than any time that I have personally followed this, the region, and perhaps any time more in the since World War II, that we are in a profound swing towards not only the left, but the populist left in Latin America. And just to name a few well-understood things. And I remember I was on the policy planning staff at the State Department in 2019, 2020, and the group of conservative, democratically oriented, like-minded allies that we had, talking about a then conservative regime in Peru, of course, President Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, others, Ivan Duque clearly in Colombia, etc. Briefly, Janine Áñez in Bolivia. The voices and the multilateral voices, such as Luis Almagro at the OAS, the Lima Group. The types of things that we were able to achieve multilaterally because of that confluence of like-minded allies. Now we're moving towards a moment in which one by one, all of that is coming undone, again, to an extent that I've never seen before in my lifetime. So it's not just a reconsolidation of power of the Maduro regime in Venezuela. It's not just the successful transition with Miguel Diaz-Canel in Cuba, even despite the July events there. It is the return to power of the MAS in Bolivia. It is the deepening leftist commitment of the more radical, La Cámpara wing of the Peronists in Argentina. Even when we look at traditionally conservative, strongly institutionalized states such as Chile, where on top of what just happened in Peru with the victory of Pedro Castillo there and Vladimir Cerrón behind him, we look at Chile and the prospect of Sebastián Piñera being replaced by this relatively young, idealistic Gabriel Boric, and some of the even farther to the left who are associated, who are in support of Frente Amplio there. We look at the prospect of some of the upcoming elections with the coming together in Honduras, for example, of the two major leftist parties, the possibility Xiomara Castro coming to power there with her Libre movement and recognizing China as she's promised. The prospects is you look in Costa Rica, which is facing an election in February where anything can happen. In Colombia, again, having worked security issues in Colombia, in the country of Alvaro Uribe, etc. Trying to think of just the unimaginable of a President Gustavo Petro, and we come back to, of course, Brazil, and if the third way center doesn't hold, my understanding is that Lula da Silva is certainly the front runner over President Bolsonaro for the October 2022 elections, something that I'm sure your audience is thinking quite a bit about. And one of the things, again, as a security analyst that worries me is not just the PT, but the journey that Lula has been on these years with his imprisonment and other things. The question then, if we have a President Lula again in 2022 with, again, a Brazil in much greater need, what President Lula actually arrives in office with respect to COVID-19, with respect to coronavirus. The one of the things, forgive me if I'm being too long-winded. I'm just
no, please. Whatever you're comfortable to speak, you are free here to do whatever you want.
Okay, you can edit out as much as you want.
No, I'll just say later about our elections, because we are all very anxious to see what will happen next year, and I'm sure you are as well. But please continue. We will add some thoughts later.
No, I appreciate it. But with respect to COVID, it is not just a matter of the health impacts on the region, and it is of note that with approximately the same number of cases in Latin America as in the United States, Latin America has had about 2.1 times as many deaths since this broke out, which is a testament of some of the problems with the health system and the coordination between public and private health. But it goes beyond the health impacts because in many ways, so many of the people who were in small and medium enterprises who were on the margins, and those businesses have often been broken. And it's not clear where those people have gone, if they found temporary opportunities in the informal sector, but there's been a structural transformation. One of the other factors is that in Latin America already struggling with inequality. There was an estimation that by the International, I'm sorry, it was by UN ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, that there was a 5 percentage point jump in inequality in the Gini index just because of COVID. At the end of the day, the people who were most hurt were the people who didn't have the middle class jobs that let them work from home and a cushion against the impacts of shutdowns and social distancing. And so you have a more unequal, more desperate, more politically mobilized region. On top of that, you have governments that are far more fiscally constrained. And I don't think we've even begun to get our hands around this yet. But there was a analysis done by International Monetary Fund that in just that year, among the wealthier of the Latin American countries, which tended to have more latitude to spend, there was a 10 percentage point jump in the debt as a fraction of GDP. And you see it right now in places like Colombia, where the attempt to impose fiscal reform is led to the ongoing protests across the country that got violent in places like Cali and really just shut down the country. You have seen it indirectly in other places. You saw it with the burning of the Parliament building and the partial burning in Guatemala a couple of months ago. You saw it with the protests against fiscal reform proposed in Costa Rica again about a year ago. Again and again across the region, even sometimes indirectly complaints and protests in Salvador because municipalities are not getting paid. So the fiscal pressures of this are creating really long-term impacts. And although governments won't admit that they can't do things or won't do things for their population, the reality, when you look at the numbers, is that we will have to deal on the other end of COVID-19 with a postponed decade of infrastructure projects and other improvements and value added, and recapitalizing the military and security forces, etc. And having said that, of course, you have dramatic transformations in the patterns of organized crime, in addition to the increases in need. And frankly, the numbers right now are all suppressed. If you think about it, in the midst of COVID-19, how many people will go into a crowded police station or the office of investigative office to report a crime that they don't think is going to be solved anyway when they could catch COVID? And so, I think that as we emerge from social distancing, we will suddenly be reporting on this explosion of crime, which was entirely, partially there all along. But on top of that, again, the desperation leads people to do things ethically that they wouldn't have done before, whether it's, people in remote Honduran villages, taking the money from helping offload the drug boat when it comes in to trucks, or whether it's allowing your bank account or your small business's bank account to be used for micro laundering activities for narco trafficking entities, and frankly, also there were a lot of shakeups in the criminal economy during COVID. So there was a real scramble, at least in Central America and in other places, to find new suppliers, to find new transportistas in Central America. And those patterns also led to changes in what is used to move drugs and other things. There was a move to a greater use of towed buoys, a greater use of submersible craft, a greater use of private watercraft. And it will take a long time for police and security in the region to catch up with new organized crime patterns. And frankly, as we found, even in Brazil, as I understand from some reports I've seen in some of the favelas, where both the gangs like the PCC and Comando Vermelho, as well as the militias, had an active part in enforcing face mask regulations and curfews and distributing food. Similar things happened with Mara Salvatrucha and Barrio 18 in El Salvador, and in other parts of Central America. And so the criminal organizations have gotten a control of neighborhoods, have deepened their control in ways even more extensive than was there before under COVID. And so you start putting all those things together and you get two more very worrisome things. Number one is you get a much higher rate of social mobilization. And again, we're seeing that across the region right now. And oftentimes the reasons are not directly COVID related, although, people are, yes, they're protesting over the inability to give enough money to help the vulnerable populations. The health scandals that have caused multiple health ministers to resign in, bribery, overpricing scandals. You need to buy a lot of stuff really quick with limited controls. What could possibly go wrong there in Latin America? And so, we've seen a lot of that frustration in Brazil and Mexico and elsewhere. Is the federal government, taking too long to act? Is it shutting down things too quickly? Are they not opening up quickly enough? Were the vaccines brought in a quick enough amount of time? So if there were frustrations in 2019 in places like Ecuador and Chile over government performance, COVID-19 has just expanded that dramatically. And so I think we're seeing a much, much more socially mobilized Latin America. And the final big piece is that it's opened broad doors for an accelerated advance by the PRC. So obviously, we've all talked about COVID diplomacy. Even in a place like Brazil, the fact that Sinovac had done some of its testing, and when Brazil couldn't get the other vaccines, that the race, especially in places like Sao Paulo, to get the Chinese vaccine, even if that meant President Bolsonaro, with his very conservative pro-U.S. politics, basically reversing himself and saying that Brazil would not exclude Huawei from 5G. And Luis Abinader in the Dominican Republic did the same thing for COVID vaccines. But it's not just the vaccine diplomacy, because vaccines are now increasingly available through the region. That Chinese advantage is fading, but it's the Chinese demand. So the role of China, for example, as a source of demand for Brazilian soy or Brazilian beef or Argentine beef and now pork, or Chilean copper or El Salvadoran sugar or Ecuadorian shrimp, especially with other traditional purchasers having relatively slow economic recoveries, the US and the European Union, that has made China's continued demand even more important. But beyond that, it's the fact that you have China as a source of investment and China as a source of loans. And so investment in the sense that you take a look at critical projects like the signature Train Maya project in Mexico with Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, and the fact that the key partner there is a Chinese partner, and the key financier is a Chinese financier. If you look at Brazil, key ports like the agricultural port of Sao Luis, where I understand that a Chinese partner could have a major role in helping to build to build that facility out. When you look at possible future investment rounds with respect to Libra, or with respect to other areas, and I understand that only recently there was an announcement of Chinese companies again expanding some of their holdings in the Brazilian offshore. But it's other sectors as well, like ride sharing, the company Didi. And again, in the face of that great amount of need, those decisions, and I believe one of the major Chinese electric car manufacturers, I believe it was BYD, just announced plans to expand. And again, the situation that COVID has left the region in really kind of sets up China as an important and key investor to get things on their terms. And what I just talked to also, the populist spread across the region, traditionally what you find is that populist governments and left of center governments are more willing to do the types of deals that are to the advantage of China, in terms of negotiating government to government deals, oftentimes less transparent, oftentimes because populist governments are with greater economic need, the Chinese can get better terms, or oftentimes because populist government bureaucracies are politicized, the Chinese government can get better terms there. And so the prospects of a region turning almost universally. I mean, if the PT returns to power, forgive my presumptions about Brazil, but at that point we could very well see the only two right of center governments in the region that would be left would be Uruguay with Lakajipo, and if he survives in power, the government, the President Lasso in Ecuador. And ironically, both of those conservative center right governments are now trying to negotiate free trade agreements with the PRC. And the other interesting thing that happened, if you go back to the 2008 global financial crisis, is that during that last somewhat smaller crisis, you had after the region came out of the crisis, a lot of Western companies, especially US and European companies, were looking to divest themselves of poorly performing assets in languishing markets like, sad to say, Latin America. If that same thing happens again after this, that desire to shore up their financial position by liquidating Latin American assets will create, just like in 2010, an enormous buying opportunity for China. And so if you pull that all together, you say that not only does Latin America have these long-term significant problems that go far beyond the health effects of COVID, but as China increasingly comes in, it's going to be interesting because China is going to be positioned to dramatically expand its presence and influence, and yet do so in a region that is far more polarized, with higher levels of criminality, with weaker institutions, setting up probably many more opportunities for the types of difficulties the Chinese companies ran into when they, last expanded in 2010. So, across the board, I think we're looking at a region that is under profound transformation, and that's going to continue. And from Washington, given that we are so deeply tied to the region by those ties of trade and investment and family and geography, the point is this is not just bad news for the region. This is something that I think at least some policymakers in Washington are beginning to think long and hard about.
That's good to know. Because here, the perception I have, and I would like you to correct me if I'm wrong, is that when I look at a security perspective, I can call a theory, for example. I can ask for Barry Boson or Oli Weaver when they wrote Regions and Powers. And they just said, when you have to solve many internal affairs, of course you will have no foreign presence. And what I see in Latin America is that we are losing so much time and energy and financial and everything to solve our inner problems that we are becoming attractive to a kind of colonization, if I can say, because we all know One Belt, One Road initiative from China means a new type of colonization for East Asia, a tougher colonization for Africa, and we are the perfect bait now because every tension is rising up in Asia. 2 days ago, we all knew China tested the crazy missile all around the globe. And this hypersonic weapon is a huge deal now because we all need to know what's happening next. Now, United States called for military exercises over Taiwan region. And of course, this means escalation. Of course, this means a new arms race, a new tension rising up. Of course, we all agree that a bellic conflict, a very big war, is not likely to happen. But at least the tensions rising up means lesser attentions on Latin America as well. This is from my point of view because the world tends to look now where the important things are. And the important things today remains the United States, Europe, and Asia. Of course, China now became very linked to Africa on colonial actions, on East Asia as well, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Vietnam. Vietnam can't even itself have a sea anymore because now they have sand tanks all around that they can use the sea as they want to do. And now what I can see is that we are becoming the perfect baits for a new type of colonization from China, especially using these advantages you pointed very well. And I would like also to thank you for the very class you gave me here. You know a lot, and this means a lot to me because we always think on United States, not thinking about Latin America, and you bring a very complex and good view. But what I want to add on this discussion is that we have an inflation problem now because we are fully dependent on China. So now the ocean rates and the air rates are rising to sky level, and all of our products now are being imported on very expensive rates, which have two ways of being solved. One, we have an industrial park again producing a lot of national goods, which I don't think will going to happen soon. Is going to happen soon, and rely on import goods from somewhere else, which I don't think it will happen as well. So, from my view, we are already colonized. It's not just the vaccine problem because you wrote very well in your paper, Vaccine Diplomacy. But I can see from all of the countries in Latin America, the only one which is doing a good effort is Uruguay. They are trying a free trade agreement with China on outside Mercosur, so they are dealing directly with China. as a way to find something new from a relationship which is already very damaged. On the other hand, Brazil seems very cheap to China. So I think they will buy everything they can.
It's interesting what you say on a number of different counts, and I particularly appreciate being able to talk about these things to a Brazilian audience. There's an excellent book. It's received very little attention on China and dependency theory by a woman by the name of Barbara Stallings, a colleague of mine, raising the question of, can dependency theory tell us something about how China is relating to Latin America? And it's interesting. Back when I first started following China, Latin America in the mid 2000s. I taught a course on this, and I used to assign my students a brief reading by actually somebody who is known in Brazil, Cardoso, with another author, Faleto, as well as Emmanuel Wallerstein and Raul Prives. But just to see if my students would draw a connection between the writings from that very different period on dependency theory and now. And again, people like President Cardoso and others, for me, the key message, is that, if a country is tied in the wrong way into the international system of value, it really matters who is getting the value added from the transactions, who has the power. The question is, are you realizing the value added from your own resources and the transformation, or do others, operate in your country and acquire those resources, extract the value added from transport, transform the goods, and then sell you back higher value added things instead of your own
Yeah,
companies selling you
perfect.
back those things. And also the question, people like Wallerstein used to write about the role of elites in host countries. Do those elites effectively collaborate with the foreign power, enriching themselves and acting as the foreign power's agent, reproducing that power relationship through their position? And what you see oftentimes is the elites who serve as the local partners of Chinese companies, and you see these struggles for value added. And one of the things that you also see is that you win some battles and you lose some battles, but I worry about the long-term losing tendency. When I following Brazil, of course, and given without defending what happened with Odebrecht in the Lava Jato scandal, but there was a time before 2014 when it was very difficult for Chinese companies to get involved in infrastructure projects in Brazil, or even things like the gassing pipeline, where China was held off from having a 70% stake by Petrobras to having I think 30% stake, because the Brazilian says, well, we have our own development bank and it's called Bandes. And it was interesting to see how, when Petrobras and Odebrecht and Bandes stumbled in 2014 and had the associated liquidity crisis, then suddenly the Chinese were coming in and they were doing the port upgrades and buying ports. They were buying out, Petrobras's holdings in places like Peru. They were accelerating their expansion into other sectors. And I mean, and you see it little by little across the region. The question of it's economic in character, but at the end of the day, you are co-opting elites, you're capturing the value added. Even a company that is as internationally able as Vale, as CVRD. It was interesting to me to see the struggle for who realizes the transshipment of iron value added. And as the Brazilian audience probably remembers, a couple of years ago, CVRD invested in this big fleet of Valimax, tankers or ships because about half of the value of iron ore is that shipment, depending on the prices. The Chinese wanted that value for themselves, and so they used the leverage of their government not to allow Valimax tankers to directly dock in Chinese ports, until at the end of the day, I believe Vale actually had to sell off some of their tankers, and is even in a situation now where it has started partnering with Chinese firms in some of its own internal port in other projects, hoping that somehow having a Chinese partner, kind of a Trojan horse in Brazil, will somehow get it better access to the Chinese market. But I see this again and again. there's I saw it with Embraer. Embraer betting on being able to get into the Chinese market, partnered with Harbin, so that they're getting into the large regional jet market in China before essentially the Chinese partner could steal all of their intellectual property and beat them out in the Chinese market. Now, Embraer has had some success, but I think some difficulties as well with this. But again and again, it's there is a there's a metaphor, and I understand. And again, coming from the United States, you'll know that my experience with jungles are not from my native United States. There's a type of vine and plant that coexist in certain types of jungles, and if the vine wraps itself and penetrates the tree too quickly, the tree dies, and they both die because it can never get to the jungle canopy. But if it doesn't penetrate quickly enough, the tree bark grows hard, and the tree survives, and the vine suffocates. And sometimes as I see China's dance with Latin America and the expectation of mutual benefit, it's that dance to the death. It's both the Latin American partner and the Chinese betting on who can take advantage of who and squeeze the life out of the other first. And again and again, it seems to be the Latin American partners who have bet in a unfortunate way. But it's a thousand little battles, and you're absolutely right. The question, and when you say, and the issue also is not creating a straw man, because the question of colonization, obviously a very politically charged word, but the issue often is that China is pursuing a different type of political relationship than that pursued by the Soviet Union. I mean, it's not trying to,
No.
overthrow governments and, like it did, backing the FMLN in El Salvador, backing the Sandinistas, the FSLN in Nicaragua, etc. Backing, frankly, the urban guerrillas in places like Brazil, as people like President Dilma have experience with. But the issue was that the Chinese, by weaving webs of economic influence, they have political effects. I mean, number one, you're not going to get any money if you don't recognize Taiwan. Your major projects will be at risk if you start talking too badly about what the Chinese are doing in Hong Kong and Xinjiang and their internal populations. And at the end of the day, even things like the Kospan, there's at least hopes that the Chinese have with their strategic partners of some levels of political coordination. And so at the end of the day, it's kind of a politics of you do what you want up to the point where you start interfering with our interests. When you start interfering with our interests, we expect you to toe our party line. And as China's position gets stronger and stronger, again, it's like the vine in a tree. There's this slow suffocating of Latin American democracy. And so I'm not sure if I would talk about traditional colonization as
We
king.
can just call it financial colonization. It's simpler because China only enters where we give them the opportunity. So the difference between them and us is that they are very pragmatic on their point of views and their actions. We are not. Dealing with Latin America for the time you already understand we are moved by emotions. So we get emotionally involved. I've never seen any Chinese action with emotion. I've been to China many times. I deal with them daily basis on for more than a decade, and I've never seen them getting emotional about anything. They just know their goals and their targets, and sooner or later they will be there. It's just a matter of when.
I do think that the Chinese do make mistakes and they have learning, and certainly the Chinese as human beings, have emotions. Obviously, the cultural, the cultural context is very different. I remember I used to teach in China, and we would get together for the picture at the end of the class, and I said, okay, is this going to be a picture in Latin American style or Chinese style? And so in Chinese style, you all stand next to each other and smile. In Latin American style, todos abrazados,
Yeah.
and but there are cultural differences. But I think it's important to recognize that there's a process of trial and error in learning with the Chinese. For example, a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to interact in China with State Grid, who has put, as I understand, something like $20 billion of investment just into electricity transmission and generation in Brazil. And what fascinated me is that State Grid, understanding it was entering the Latin American market, had set up a pretty sophisticated training program for its senior manager on technical personnel. How you do things in a Latin American context, cultural sensitivity and laws and security and style. And if you look at some of the early Chinese buy-ins in the mining sector in Peru, places like Marcona back in the 90s, and or some of the problems that they ran in Argentina with some of the early mines or the oil sector. Um, the Chinese today have gotten more sophisticated in integrating local labor and local management. In Brazil, Huawei sponsors local soccer teams, and you see Huawei on the jerseys. Um, so what worries me is that China's investment in physical presence on the ground is not only expanding, but as they expand, and we say, oh, the Chinese are clumsy in this, and so we don't have to worry. But the reality is they are rapidly learning, and they're using that learning so that not only is their influence increasing through their expanding presence as employers and investors, but they're getting better and better at using the influence that they have to protect their interests and in political and in other types of ways. You see it in the automotive industry. Again, you see it even in the agricultural sector. I remember a couple of years ago that the Chinese wanted to compete against ADM and Bunji and Dreyfus and Cargill, and they tried to get into, I believe it was Bahia with Chongqing grain, and I think the established players basically managed to just completely paralyze the project. But then they got smart and they said, "Hey, we're going to channel our money into these smaller companies, Nadera and Noble, which have a presence in Brazil, and we're going to start channeling our demand, China Oilseeds and Foodstuffs Co. COFCO, through Nadera and Noble." And today you're beginning to see in some segments of the market, Nadera and Noble are causes of concern for the big aggregate exporters. And so across the board, as the Chinese not only get bigger, but as they get better,
Better, much better.
it it, it's not. We can't say that where the Chinese are at today should give us assurance, because just the fact that they are on the ground means that they are learning and improving, and we have to adapt, as they adapt.
Yes, this is the thing. This is the pragmatic thing I appreciate the most. When I say emotional, is that we take decisions from our hearts, not from our minds. The Chinese, they do exactly like you pointed out. They learn, they improve, and when you notice them, they are already inside something you just can't go out. So it's like a web. We are being caught on a spider's web because at the time we know where we are, it's too late. This is the point of view I want to bring here, and I can't thank you enough for the very strong points you added here. Latin America is facing also the corrosion of our currencies. And I would like to know from your point of view, as we are also being notified that the United States is lacking of people to work because of Biden's policies of providing the help, the money, the welfare state that he's trying to figure out, but nobody knows better. Nobody knows what's going to happen. So, in your mind, what's the possibility of the Fed to add up the interest rates and create a new economic tragedy like the 80s? I don't know if you foresee that, if you believe in that, or What's your thinking? Because this is another thing. If we have a big financial crisis in Latin America, and I mean the evasion of US dollars, this will open a new opportunity for China and for other powers that is to replace the currency, replace the bargain factors, replace the way we do business. Everything here is transacted in United States dollars today.
You, you raised a number of really important points. I mean, one is the question of what happens to the U.S. economy and in other economies, and you're right. On the one hand, you have very fragile fiscal balances across the region. You have very precarious situations of companies, especially having gone through COVID-19. You have other other reasons to worry. When you talk about the United States, as you rightfully point out, because of the stimulus, and this is repeated in other countries in the region as well, but certainly in the United States, with the trillions of dollars of stimulus, taking advantage of the fact that the world is willing to supply dollars to the United States. The prospect of already with inflation at over 5 percentage points and probably rising of a another $3 trillion in infrastructure stimulus, which would pump more money into that. And as the Wall Street Journal just pointed out recently, also reduce the labor supply. Certainly that has the prospect of being very inflationary. Now, so the question is, how does that play out? It certainly hasn't played out in real estate markets, which was, of course, the source of the last major financial crisis. And when people are as leveraged as they are, going from effectively a 0% interest rate in the United States, even a couple percentage points will, knock the bottom out of the housing market and will put a lot of things at risk. So the interesting, we are, I believe, at a very critical point, but it's also possible to look in different ways. On the one hand, you have prospects for global calamity on the U.S. and Latin American side. On the other hand, there are perhaps some of the most credible reasons to believe, without knowing yet, that although China right now is growing, maybe at 7%, maybe a little bit slower, but if you look at what has happened, with the recent real estate scandal and having to and understanding how many other highly indebted companies there are in China that could collapse. Some of the pushback with President Xi's policies, some of the levels of debt that Chinese municipalities, as well as the federal government, as well as companies, actually have. And for the first time, you're actually talking about China not being able to infrastructure spend its way out of the current crisis as it did with the previous one. And so while I'm not predicting the imminent collapse of China, we're at a point right now where we can see the possibility of a Western severe crisis, which China benefits from, a Chinese crisis, which reaps chaos in the West. And as you alluded to before, again, never in my lifetime have we been so close to the possibility of seeing a war break out across the Taiwan Straits, with now more than 150 PLA aircraft incursions into Taiwanese airspace, and the threats just continue. The or a mutually reinforcing crisis, because China holds so many U.S. Treasury bonds, either purposefully or necessity, dumping them, or vice versa. That I cannot think of when we have been so close to the possibility of a crisis on one side or the other. Now, the question of who's left standing, if anyone, is I'm not sure how quick I am to come down one way or another, but I think if we enter into a major crisis, the type that you're talking about here, I think all sides will be enormously transformed. And again, these are not just making things up. These are I think real risks that that one can begin to see in ways that frighten me more than any outlook that I've seen, again, in the time that I've been an analyst.
Hearing you makes me think about interdependence, right? We can say the complex interdependence and everything else, and all the theories goes to the ground when we think about the prospect of war. And once again, war is far from the territory of United States and a bit closer to Chinese territory. Do you think we can say from all of the minutes we are talking here that United States is a much bigger and better built wall than the Chinese wall?
It's interesting. I remember in some of the work that I've done, even back in the 90s, some of us looking at the rise of China and what that could be militarily and politically and other things. Um, Certainly, I think it's difficult for a power who has been so dominant for so long as the United States to imagine that it could be any other way, and to recognize that the transformation of the world. Um, I think there are a lot and war is very uncertain, as you know, and surprising things can happen. So if you look at the prospect of a real shooting war, and again, I do not see it that unthinkable, given where the Chinese leadership is at, given their understanding that their back is against the wall. I mean, there's been some interesting articles that talk about Chinese weakness and fragility actually pushing them towards acting in a moment, but that very moment actually playing into Chinese fragility. But you know, but given that we're in a place that it's not unthinkable to see a war across the Taiwanese Straits, especially if China calculates, well, the United States pulled out of Afghanistan, would they actually defend, Taiwan? Something that, they are openly, saying, some of their wolf warrior diplomats. And at the end of the day, especially if the United States, were to lose a couple of carriers, major surface combatants, and it looked like it was going to be a much more protracted, campaign. You know, many people calculating, well, would the United States stick it out, or would it, sue for peace? And again, those calculations begin to affect how certain countries that may not look at the United States favorably might respond to, a Chinese request to provide, for example, temporary peaceful base access in the midst of such a conflict. Without mentioning any names of specific regimes, but if you think back to World War I, when the Germans tried to interest the Mexicans into trying to retake some of that recently lost territory, like California and Texas, that the concept of betting against the United States is not as far fetched for some as you might seem. But at the end of the day, you referred to again, the types of technology, the DF-21D, or the hypersonic glide vehicle that the Chinese most recently unlaunched, or the space and ASAT capabilities, or the cyber capabilities. There is a lot and certainly the United States has certain advantages. Certainly its carrier operations, the stealth of its submarines, the experience of its personnel in certain areas. But at the same time, I think that I suspect that while my military colleagues feel a certain amount of rightful pride and hubris, as I'm sure our Brazilian, your Brazilian military counterparts with whom I've had the honor of working on occasion do, um,
Uh,
people who are technically competent officers also know not to let hubris cause them to overestimate their vulnerability and the capabilities of their adversary. And
of course.
so I worry profoundly about where the Chinese are at right now with their global capabilities. I don't think you know, it's uh, it's difficult to know how a war between China and the United States would ultimately play out, or how long, or whether it would be limited to conventional weapons.
Yeah,
But as an economic war, I think it would be a grave, grave situation that hopefully
a grave
both sides
disaster. But I can say, I will tell you from my perspective, that means nothing worldwide. I don't think we will ever see the MAD again, the mutual assured destruction, because it's not seen possible to China to arrange such a scenario. But what's it's becoming very clear to me is that we are starting working again with the preventional war theory, because if you wait too long, of course China will reach the possibilities and the stakes to make a huge damage. And if it is to wait how long? So in my mind, I believe we are start facing the arms race on a new level, because technology today is different from before. The learning curve today is much easier than before. And China really seems to be pursuing the capabilities for becoming a, how can I tell you, a power bigger than the Soviet Union was before. But today they are not. And when you talk about the Taiwan Strait, and of course we need to take Japan, South Korea, all into the same scenario. And of course, a huge battle like that wouldn't be fought alone by China and United States. Of course, the world would be drained to take sides and do its efforts to any side of the other, which makes me rethink again on the Chinese participation on Latin America as a web deepened so much that when we talk about the 5G going to Huawei, and I can tell you, Brazilian government, despite what they say, they are much more prone to Chinese technology than ever before. The assumption of Huawei getting the 5G cooperation and licitations and everything else in Brazil is real. It's real, very real. While we have Ericsson, we have a lot of other Western companies here, since we have a good, I don't know how to tell you, we have a good perception of the Chinese efforts as a lesser evil than United States. A heritage, I believe, we take from the 60s and from the 70s, from the dependency theory. Much of the government, much of the people, much of the politicians, they tend to see United States as the imperialist. And if I take colonization on the wrong way when I say that Chinese is colonizing, because I'm thinking on economic colonization, not on the power regimes and takeovers as before, they still see United States as a threat to regimes, while we all know 21st century demands a very different way of looking to the world. And this delayed view of the worldwide politics is, I believe, is one of the biggest causes of our delays in development, in progress, in growth. And hearing from you makes me think twice on what I think about China, because one thing is that I deal with them on daily basis and I like their people, but I don't want to be on the rule of the Chinese government. I wouldn't adapt to that. And I believe the Western culture is not compatible to the government, to their way of governing. And I really want to thank you because you gave me a lot to think about. And I don't know when I'll be able to edit this video because I want to make a lot of cuts to add a lot of parts in it. And if you are okay with that, I really would like to invite you come here again, because it's a very big pleasure for me hearing from you and learning a lot from you.
No, I've enjoyed it. I'm happy to have the opportunity. I appreciate your interest. Yeah, I hope my responses haven't been too long-winded, but it's I've enjoyed the conversation. But I do think you say one, I think, very important thing, and I completely agree with you, because I also have Chinese friends and colleagues, and I have China has just as much right to develop and its people to be prosperous as the U.S. or Brazil or Colombia or any other state. The issue that worries me is really twofold. One is that the how that the Chinese state and its companies are doing things, and the way in which the combination of the how and its size is undermining democracy, as we talked about in the region, is undermining. The Chinese are not trying to overthrow democratic regimes, but by pursuing their interests in populist states, they're making making the world less populous. By pursuing their projects, and being willing to bribe or do other things to win, they're making the region, more corrupt and less governed. And what you also point out too is that the Chinese tradition is very different from the U.S. tradition in terms of ideas about the inalienable rights of states and people. Western democracy is not a Chinese concept. And as you point out, although the Chinese have many rich and important and beautiful things in their culture and, Taoist traditions and Confucius traditions and others, I'm not sure that I'm not sure that I would be very happy working in a Chinese company, and I'm not sure I would be very happy working in a Chinese-dominated political system in which my relationships curtailed what I was free to say or not say or do or not do, and that I as the it's like we're used to being on top of the pile in the United States, and so while there are perhaps many in Latin America that would find it ironic, the gringos being worried about their position in the pecking order being subordinate because of the non-Chinese ethnicity and color of their skin. We're moving towards a world that I think would make most of us profoundly uncomfortable if we don't stand up for the types of institutions and principles of democracy and rights of people and states that really are at the heart of, I think, everything that we celebrate. And so it's not that the Chinese are trying to take that away from us, but it's that the Chinese, in pursuing their own interests, are so big and doing it in a way that it's taking a wrecking ball to everything that we cherish. And as somebody who cherishes those things, it worries me deeply.
Yeah, I understand, and I couldn't agree more on what you say. It's I think we finally will see the clash of civilizations. I don't know what Huntington would find about that, but we can have a clue later.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ellis. It's a real pleasure for me to speak with you and finally knowing you better, because I read your papers and I can tell you a lot of things to discuss we'll still have. And if I can count on your presence here later, it will be perfect for me, and I believe for the audience as well.
And if I may ask, what's the typical audience that you reach through your broadcast?
The topic here is international relations studies,
Mm-hmm.
because it's my specialty,
Mm-hmm.
and people who is doing foreign commerce,
Okay.
dealing with the other countries, especially China and the United States. So this is a channel focused on foreign commerce and foreign politics.
Okay.
All of the videos are in Portuguese yet. I'm still practicing my English. It's not good yet.
Your English is fantastic. I'm more than impressed.
Thank you very much. It's really helpful for me because I've been a lot of time without speaking with an American. I speak mostly with Chinese, Indians, and their English is not a good pattern for learning and practicing. So I can tell you that most of the videos are related to the foreign commerce, and the main concerns of the video is that what to expect after COVID, because we are all seeing the international the crisis deepen, and I can tell you I've never seen China without containers.
Yeah.
It's been a hell lot of me because I'm the pricing manager of a logistics company, so I'm 24/7 linked to this, and this loop is driving me nuts. And
Yeah. Yeah. I spend a lot of time also worrying about logistics, and yeah, the shipping crisis right now is just it
Yeah,
shows you how fragile this sophisticated system is, and
yeah,
it's incredible how screwed up things. It's going to take a year at least to get things unscrewed.
yeah. And you can tell if Long Beach port suffering, you can
Yeah.
imagine our small ports here because our vessels are lesser in capabilities. They have
Hmm.
lesser ports to work, and I can tell you, it's hard. It's really hard.
You're having the same type of backup from the workers and equipment bottlenecks that we have in Long Beach.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
have now, I believe, 56 vessels waiting. The
Yeah.
problem on our routing is that the vessels are not leaving China
Hmm.
because they are so small and our route is so small comparing to elsewhere that they are making the priorities to Europe and to United States, and we are left on the fourth routing. So our vessels are delayed 45 to 60 days.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, so you can say the supply chain here is
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah. That's it. Well, I very much look forward to staying in touch with you. And this has been I've enjoyed this, and happy to do this again in the future if it would be of use to you in the program. And again, just
Thank you very much.
I had the pleasure of meeting a lot of people over the years as I've done this, and it's always interesting the direction that those friendships and collegial relationships take you. So it's nice to meet you, and I look forward to continuing to work with you.
It's my pleasure, and I believe soon, if you have time, we will have some coffee at Pennsylvania because I need to go to United States in the coming year, and hopefully we can meet and drink some coffee and talk a little more.
Well, please let me know. I'm actually I live in Frederick, but I'm about an hour out of Washington, which is really kind of my key base. But yeah, if you're in Pennsylvania or Washington D.C. or wherever, let me know. I'd love